What happens when silence becomes more terrifying than a beating? What secrets can a man reveal when the only voice he hears is his own? In this story, a Soviet prisoner unknowingly speaks his own sentence. Hours of confession, terrifying truths, and psychological manipulation, some of them so dark, so shameful, he never intended to admit them. By the end, you'll discover the cruel trap that broke him, and the shocking twist no one could have predicted. The room where the interrogation began did not resemble any place designed for speech, memory, or truth. And that was precisely why it worked. It was a square space of concrete whose walls had been painted many times, so many layers that the corners had softened and rounded as if time itself had tried to erase the edges. There was no table, no documents in sight, no lamp aimed at the face, only two wooden chairs placed at an exact distance from each other, neither close enough for intimacy nor far enough for safety. The ceiling was low, pressing down on the air, and the single bulb above gave off a tired light that did not flicker, as though it had already learned not to protest. The prisoner was led inside without ceremony. His hands were free, which unsettled him more than chains would have. The guards placed him on one chair, nodded once, and left. The door closed with a sound so soft it seemed almost polite, as if the room wished to convince him that nothing violent would happen here. For a long moment he remained alone, listening to his own breathing, which sounded too loud, too personal, as if the room were eavesdropping. Then the other man entered. The investigator did not wear a uniform, and that absence of insignia made him harder to read than any decorated officer. He sat down slowly, carefully, as though measuring the space with his body, aligning himself with the room. He folded his hands on his knees and lowered his gaze slightly, not enough to look away, not enough to look directly. The prisoner waited for the ritual to begin, for the clearing of the throat, for the inevitable opening phrase that would announce the charges, or at least acknowledge the presence of another human being. Nothing happened. The silence was immediate and complete, thickening the air until it felt almost viscous. The bulb hummed faintly, a sound so steady it soon disappeared from awareness, leaving behind a sensation of pressure in the ears. The investigator did not move. He did not blink in any way the prisoner could notice. He simply sat, breathing so quietly that it was impossible to tell whether he was breathing at all. At first the prisoner interpreted this as a tactic delayed, a test of endurance meant to unsettle him before the real interrogation began. He straightened his back, fixed his eyes on a spot just above the investigator's shoulder, and decided to wait. He had been warned during the transport that patience was a form of resistance, that silence could protect a man better than clever words. He counted his breaths. He recalled fragments of poems he had memorized years earlier. He tried to imagine the smell of bread from his childhood kitchen, warm and impossible. Time stretched without shape. Without a clock, minutes lost their meaning. The prisoner became aware of his own body in an intimate and humiliating way. His foot itched. His throat grew dry. His stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with a slow, coiling anxiety that did not spike, but accumulated. The investigator remained motionless, an object rather than a presence, and that unnerved the prisoner more than open hostility would have. Eventually, a thought crept in that he did not invite. Perhaps the investigator was waiting for something specific, some signal or mistake that would give him permission to begin. Perhaps the rules here were different, inverted, and speech itself was the trap. The prisoner swallowed and adjusted his posture, careful not to make noise, as though sound itself might be recorded by the walls. The first crack appeared not as fear, but as doubt. Was this still an interrogation, or had it already ended without his knowledge? The idea that he might already have failed without speaking a word sent a chill through him. He glanced briefly at the investigator's face, searching for irritation, boredom, or cruelty. There was nothing. The expression was not blank, but unfinished, like a sentence that had stopped halfway through. The prisoner felt an urge rise within him, subtle at first, then insistent. It was not yet the urge to confess, but the urge to confirm his own existence. Silence, when shared, is tolerable. Silence imposed by another, absolute and unresponsive, begins to feel like erasure. He shifted again, this time deliberately, letting the chair scrape faintly against the floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have. The investigator did not react. The prisoner cleared his throat. The sound startled him, sharp and intrusive in the stillness. He waited for a response, for the investigator to look up, to signal disapproval or encouragement. Nothing followed. The silence absorbed the noise as though it had never happened. That was when the prisoner spoke for the first time, not because he had decided to, but because the words had already formed and demanded release. He said something ordinary, something harmless, a comment about the length of the transport and the cold of the corridors. He told himself this did not count as real speech, that it was merely filling a void while waiting for the actual interrogation to begin. The words hung in the air, fragile and exposed. He waited for interruption, for correction, for accusation. None came. The investigator remained perfectly still, eyes lowered, hands folded, offering no sign that the sound had reached him at all. Relief washed over the prisoner, immediate and shameful. Speaking had not resulted in punishment. The room had not collapsed. The silence had not retaliated. Encouraged by the absence of consequences, he continued, elaborating on his initial remark, adding small details that felt safe and irrelevant. He spoke of the train, of the men who had coughed through the night, of the way frost had traced patterns on the inside of the window like a second landscape superimposed on the world. As he spoke, something subtle shifted within him. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. His breathing steadied. The room felt marginally less hostile, as though it had accepted his voice as part of its architecture. He began to believe that the investigator's silence was not a weapon, but a flaw, perhaps even indifference. The thought offended him more than fear would have. To be interrogated was one thing. To be ignored was another. He spoke more quickly now, filling the gaps before the silence could reclaim them. He explained that he did not understand why he had been brought here, that there must have been a misunderstanding, that his work had always been loyal, careful, unremarkable. He avoided certain words instinctively, terms that had become dangerous through repetition, and replaced them with vague assurances of dedication and obedience. The investigator listened, or appeared to. His posture did not change. His gaze did not lift. Yet the prisoner felt increasingly observed, as though every word were being weighed by something deeper than human attention. The absence of visible reaction forced the prisoner to imagine one, and his imagination proved far harsher than any expression could have been. He began to justify himself preemptively, responding to accusations that had not been voiced. He explained his friendships, clarifying which were superficial and which had faded long ago. He described his habits, emphasizing their predictability. He spoke of his parents, of their simple lives and unquestioned loyalty, as though lineage itself could serve as evidence. At some point, he realized that he had been speaking continuously for a long time. His mouth felt dry, his tongue thick. He paused, waiting for a cue, a sign that it was acceptable to stop. The silence rushed back instantly, heavier now, almost reproachful. The relief he had felt moments earlier inverted into discomfort. The quiet no longer felt neutral. It felt expectant. The prisoner experienced a sudden, irrational fear that if he stopped speaking entirely, something irreversible would happen. He did not know what form it would take. He only knew that the silence now carried weight, and that weight pressed directly on him. He resumed speaking, this time more carefully, selecting his words with precision. He reviewed past actions in chronological order, searching for anything that might be construed as suspicious and neutralizing it with context and explanation. He admitted to small failings, minor doubts, harmless frustrations, believing that controlled honesty would demonstrate sincerity. Each admission felt like a calculated sacrifice offered to appease an unseen mechanism. The investigator remained silent. Gradually, the prisoner's careful balance eroded. The effort of constant self-monitoring exhausted him. His thoughts began to drift, circling back to moments he had not planned to mention. He recalled a meeting years ago where he had laughed at the wrong time. He remembered a private thought, fleeting but sincere, that had contradicted the official narrative. He told himself these were insignificant, yet the silence across from him seemed to swell whenever he approached these memories, as though drawing them out by force of gravity alone. He spoke of them hesitantly, framing them as misunderstandings, even to himself. He insisted that thoughts were not actions, that doubts were natural and transient. He spoke faster now, afraid that hesitation itself might be interpreted as guilt. The room felt smaller. The bulb seemed dimmer, though its light had not changed. A strange sensation took hold of him, one he had never experienced before. It felt as though he were being emptied, not violently, but thoroughly, like a room being cleared of furniture until nothing remained but the walls. Words poured out of him, no longer strictly controlled, drawn forward by the need to keep the silence at bay. He spoke of fear, of the way it had shaped his behavior, of compromises made quietly and alone. He framed these confessions as proof of weakness rather than malice, hoping weakness would be forgiven where defiance would not. At no point did the investigator intervene. The lack of interruption created the illusion of safety, but it was a safety that demanded constant payment in speech. The prisoner began to sense that the room itself was recording him, that the walls had learned his voice and were storing it somewhere beyond reach. When his throat finally forced him to stop, when his mouth refused to form another sentence without water, he looked up in desperation, silently begging for the process to change. The investigator did not move. The silence did not soften. In that moment, the prisoner understood that this was not a delay before the interrogation. This was the interrogation, and it was far from over. When the prisoner fell silent again, it was not by choice, but by physical limitation, as if his body had finally imposed a boundary his will no longer could. His lips were cracked, his tongue heavy, and every breath scraped faintly against his throat. He waited for the investigator to acknowledge this limit, to offer water, to signal a transition, but nothing changed. The man across from him remained still, sealed inside his posture, an embodiment of patience so absolute it felt inhuman. The silence now was different from before. It was no longer empty. It was saturated with everything the prisoner had already said. Each word lingered, stacking upon the previous ones, forming an invisible structure that filled the room more completely than any furniture could. The prisoner felt surrounded by his own voice, trapped inside a monument he had built unknowingly and too quickly. A new fear emerged, colder and more precise than the earlier anxiety. It was the fear of inconsistency. Having spoken so much, he could no longer remember every detail of what he had said, every nuance, every phrasing. If questioned now, he might contradict himself. The idea of contradiction terrified him more than the content of his admissions, because contradiction implied deceit, and deceit implied intent. He had always believed that sincerity, even when flawed, offered some form of protection. Now he realized that sincerity without control was simply another kind of exposure. He resumed speaking not to add anything new, but to stabilize what had already been said. He repeated certain points, rephrased others, tightened explanations that now felt loose and dangerous. He reassured himself aloud, insisting that his loyalty had always outweighed his doubts, that his actions had never crossed the invisible lines that everyone sensed but no one could clearly define. He hoped that repetition would smooth the rough edges of his earlier confessions, that familiarity would dilute their impact. The investigator's silence did not confirm or deny any of this. It did something worse. It treated every word with the same indifference, granting equal weight to reassurance and doubt, to loyalty and fear. In that neutrality, the prisoner sensed a terrible fairness. Nothing would be dismissed. Nothing would be emphasized. Everything would be preserved exactly as offered. As time passed, fatigue began to erode the prisoner's sense of sequence. Thoughts surfaced without warning, memories detached from their original context. He spoke of his childhood now, not because it was relevant, but because it felt safer than the recent past. He described his father's hands, rough and cracked from labor, and his mother's habit of straightening objects that were already straight. He spoke of school lessons memorized word for word, of the comfort found in repetition and structure. These memories steadied him briefly, anchoring him to a version of himself that existed before fear had become a daily companion. Yet even these recollections carried risks he could not fully perceive. He mentioned a teacher who had disappeared one winter, the way the class had been told not to ask questions, the quiet understanding that settled over the room like dust. He spoke of how he had learned then that silence could be protective, that survival often depended on what one chose not to notice. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt a surge of regret. He had framed the lesson too clearly, drawn a line too directly between awareness and compliance. He tried to correct himself, to reframe the memory as naive misunderstanding, but the damage was already done. Or perhaps it had always been inevitable. The silence did not allow for erasure, only accumulation. The prisoner became increasingly aware of the investigator's physical presence, not through movement, but through absence of it. The man did not shift his weight, did not stretch, did not show signs of fatigue. This unnatural stillness suggested a role rather than a person, a function rather than a personality. The prisoner began to suspect that the investigator's task was not to extract information, but to receive it, to act as a fixed point against which the prisoner's instability could fully express itself. This realization did not bring clarity. It brought desperation. If there were no questions, there could be no right answers. If there were no accusations, there could be no defense. The prisoner was navigating without markers, guided only by his own fear of silence and his equally strong fear of saying too much. The two forces pulled him in opposite directions, tearing at him slowly. At some point, he began to speak not to justify himself, but to explain the world. He described the atmosphere of constant vigilance, the unspoken rules that governed conversations, the way people learn to read each other's pauses more carefully than their words. He spoke as though offering sociological insight, distancing himself from personal involvement. He framed his observations as objective, analytical, almost academic, hoping that this tone would suggest detachment rather than complicity. Yet objectivity itself became suspect in his own ears. Each analysis implied awareness. Each observation suggested an internal distance from the official narrative. He tried to counterbalance this by emphasizing fear, by portraying himself as reactive rather than reflective, shaped by forces beyond his control. He spoke of nights spent listening for footsteps in the stairwell, of the way sleep fractured under the weight of anticipation. He described how fear reduced thought to instinct, how it narrowed the mind until only survival remained. Still, the silence did not change. It absorbed fear as readily as reason. The prisoner's sense of time collapsed further. He no longer knew whether hours or minutes had passed. His body ached from sitting, yet he was afraid to move too much, afraid that any sudden motion might be interpreted as agitation or aggression. He existed in a narrow corridor between exhaustion and alertness, kept upright by adrenaline alone. In this state, control slipped further. He began to anticipate objections that had not been raised, responding to imagined criticisms with increasing urgency. He denied intentions he had never articulated. He clarified positions no one had challenged. The narrative he was constructing grew more complex, more detailed, and therefore more fragile. Each addition created new points of potential failure. He started to notice patterns in his own speech, recurring themes that troubled him. He returned again and again to the idea of fear as justification, of power as inevitability. Without intending to, he revealed a worldview shaped by resignation rather than belief. He spoke of adaptation as virtue, of silence as wisdom, of inward retreat as the only remaining freedom. These ideas, once voiced, sounded dangerously close to critique. The investigator remained silent, but the prisoner imagined he felt the room lean closer at these moments, as though the air itself were attentive. He wondered whether the walls truly were recording him, whether some mechanism hidden within the concrete was capturing every inflection. The thought intensified his panic. He began to speak more deliberately, trying to control not just content, but tone, smoothing emotion out of his voice until it sounded flat and rehearsed. This artificial calm did not last. Fatigue undermined it quickly. Emotion seeped back in, uninvited and uncontrollable. His voice wavered as he spoke of isolation, of the slow erosion of trust between people, of the way even friendships became performances. He admitted that he no longer knew how to speak honestly without fear, that every sentence felt like a risk assessment rather than an expression. As soon as he said this, he realized how it might be interpreted. He rushed to explain, to contextualize, to soften the statement, but his words tangled. The more he tried to clarify, the more confused the narrative became. He felt himself losing command of the structure he had been building since the first moment he opened his mouth. A wave of anger surged unexpectedly, directed not at the investigator, but at the silence itself. He resented its passivity, its refusal to engage. He felt mocked by its endurance. For a brief moment, he considered stopping entirely, refusing to speak another word no matter the consequences. The thought offered a sharp, intoxicating sense of agency. He tested the idea by pausing deliberately, crossing his arms, fixing his gaze on the investigator's face. The silence responded instantly, expanding to fill the space he had vacated. It pressed against him with renewed force, stripping the gesture of its defiance and rendering it meaningless. The investigator did not acknowledge the pause as resistance. He treated it as absence, and absence was easily tolerated. The prisoner broke first. He spoke again, faster, almost breathlessly, driven by the need to reclaim relevance. He began to narrate events surrounding his arrest, reconstructing the sequence in meticulous detail. He described the knock at the door, the precise words spoken by the officers, the way his neighbors' doors had remained closed. He insisted on his cooperation, on the lack of resistance, on the normalcy of his behavior. Each detail was meant to demonstrate predictability, compliance, harmlessness. Yet in recounting these moments, he revealed emotional responses he had not intended to share. He admitted to relief at the clarity of arrest, to a strange calm that had settled once uncertainty was replaced by certainty. He confessed that part of him had been waiting for this moment, that constant anticipation had been worse than the reality itself. As soon as the words left him, he felt exposed in a new way. Relief implied acceptance. Acceptance implied agreement. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound died quickly in the air, obscene and misplaced. The silence did not rebuke him. It did not need to. By the time his voice faltered again, the prisoner felt hollowed out, as though the essential parts of him had been extracted and laid bare. He no longer knew what remained unsaid, and that terrified him more than what he had already confessed. The silence had not forced him to speak. It had simply waited, confident that he would do so on his own. Somewhere in the depths of his exhaustion, a final, chilling understanding took shape. The investigator did not need to accuse him of anything specific. The accumulation of his own words would create accusations far more precise and personal than any external charge ever could. He sat there, breathing shallowly, aware that whatever came next would be built entirely from what he had already given. At some indeterminate point, when exhaustion dulled even fear into a distant echo, the prisoner became aware of a new sensation that unsettled him more deeply than hunger or thirst. It was the sense that the interrogation had acquired a direction without ever announcing one. The silence no longer felt neutral or even merely patient. It felt arranged, as if everything that had already been said had quietly settled into an order he could not see. He tried to recall the beginning, to trace the moment when control had slipped from him, but memory resisted structure. His thoughts returned in fragments rather than sequences. Words he remembered saying felt detached from the intentions that had produced them. He could no longer tell which statements had been strategic and which had been confessions, which had been meant to protect him and which had betrayed him. The distinction itself began to feel artificial, a comfort invented after the fact. The investigator shifted for the first time. It was not a dramatic movement, not even a clear one. The man merely adjusted his hands, uncrossing and then rejoining his fingers with slow precision. The sound of fabric brushing against fabric seemed impossibly loud. The prisoner's heart lurched, convinced that this small motion marked a transition, that speech would finally be acknowledged or redirected. But the investigator did not look up. He did not speak. The movement ended as quietly as it had begun, leaving behind a heightened awareness that every detail, no matter how small, could carry meaning far beyond its size. The prisoner's thoughts began to reorganize themselves around this moment. If movement was possible, then choice existed. If choice existed, then silence was not emptiness, but intention. This realization changed the nature of the room. What had once felt like absence now felt like restraint deliberately maintained. He began speaking again, slower this time, as though navigating unstable ground. He revisited earlier statements, not to repeat them, but to contextualize them, attempting to build a framework that would render his admissions coherent rather than contradictory. He emphasized causality, stress, external pressure. He explained how circumstances shaped behavior, how fear narrowed options until compliance seemed indistinguishable from survival. As he spoke, he noticed that his language had shifted. He no longer said "I" as often. He favored constructions that dissolved responsibility into systems and forces, into atmospheres and inevitabilities. He described himself less as an actor and more as a vessel, shaped by currents too strong to resist. He hoped this dilution of agency would soften the implications of his earlier words. Yet something in him recoiled from this strategy even as he pursued it. To erase agency entirely felt like a different kind of confession, an admission of emptiness. He sensed that portraying himself as powerless might be interpreted not as innocence, but as moral vacancy. The silence offered no guidance. It accepted every version of him with equal indifference. The prisoner's awareness turned inward with increasing intensity. He began to monitor not just what he said, but why he felt compelled to say it. Each impulse to speak became suspect. He wondered whether the need to explain was itself a sign of guilt, whether innocence would have endured the silence without flinching. This thought tormented him, because he could not remember ever being innocent in the absolute sense the word now seemed to demand. He spoke of this ambiguity, of the impossibility of purity in a world structured around fear. He argued, without realizing it, that morality itself had become contextual, dependent on proximity to power. He framed this as observation rather than critique, but the distinction grew thinner with every sentence. The investigator's stillness transformed these reflections into declarations. Without interruption, without resistance, every thought reached the surface fully formed, stripped of the hesitations that might have softened it in conversation. The prisoner realized that silence removed the natural friction that dialogue provided. There was no opportunity for misunderstanding to dilute meaning, no chance for correction to reframe intention. Words emerged unchallenged and therefore complete. He began to fear his own clarity. Memories surfaced that he had not considered in years. A moment when he had chosen not to warn a colleague. A time when he had repeated an official phrase without believing it, simply because it was easier than silence. A fleeting satisfaction at being overlooked, at remaining unremarkable while others were singled out. Each memory arrived with emotional residue that betrayed him more than the facts themselves. He tried to narrate these moments as evidence of caution rather than betrayal, but his voice lacked conviction. The room did not validate his interpretations. It did not contradict them either. It merely held them intact and unaltered. The prisoner's sense of self began to fracture under this sustained exposure. He felt as though he were watching himself from a distance, observing the gradual construction of a version of himself that felt both familiar and alien. This version was articulate, reflective, painfully honest. It was also deeply compromised. The silence had given him the freedom to speak without restraint, and that freedom had revealed truths he had never intended to articulate, perhaps never fully acknowledged. He wondered whether this was the true purpose of the room, not to extract secrets, but to remove the internal censor that allowed a man to live with himself. Without opposition, without fear of immediate reprisal, the mind wandered into regions usually kept private. Silence, he realized, could be more permissive than threat, and permission could be more dangerous than force. The idea unsettled him profoundly. He had always believed that danger came from pressure, from coercion, from pain. He had prepared himself mentally for those possibilities. He had not prepared for being allowed to speak freely, to explore his own reasoning without interruption, to hear his thoughts echoed back only by their own persistence. As exhaustion deepened, his language grew more abstract. He spoke of identity as a series of adjustments, of truth as something negotiated daily. He questioned whether sincerity was possible under constant surveillance, whether any statement made in such a context could be considered genuine. In articulating these doubts, he inadvertently demonstrated the very awareness that could be interpreted as subversive. He caught himself mid-sentence, alarmed by the direction of his thoughts. He attempted to reverse course, to anchor himself in safer territory, but the transition felt forced and transparent. The flow he had established resisted abrupt changes. The silence did not allow for rhetorical resets. Everything remained continuous, connected. The prisoner felt trapped not by the room, but by the coherence of his own narrative. Having revealed his internal logic, he could not easily contradict it without appearing dishonest. The more he spoke, the more his worldview solidified into something examinable, something that could be judged. At one point, his voice broke, not into tears, but into something more unsettling. A flatness settled over his speech, an emotional numbness that stripped words of urgency. He spoke as though reading from a document he did not remember writing, reciting conclusions that felt inevitable rather than chosen. This detachment frightened him. It suggested that he was no longer fully present, that part of him had withdrawn to protect what little remained. The investigator's silence seemed to accommodate this withdrawal effortlessly. It did not demand engagement. It did not object to monotony. It allowed the prisoner to continue in whatever state he occupied, confident that even detachment produced usable material. The prisoner began to imagine the aftermath of this encounter. He pictured himself returning to a cell, replaying the interrogation endlessly, searching for the moment where everything had gone wrong. He imagined documents filled with his own words, stripped of tone and fatigue, transformed into evidence. The thought made his stomach twist. He realized that his greatest fear was not punishment, but misrepresentation, the possibility that his words would outlive their context. He attempted, clumsily, to provide that context himself. He spoke of exhaustion, of confusion, of the unnatural conditions of the room. He described the silence as a force, as an influence that shaped speech in unpredictable ways. In doing so, he named the very mechanism that ensnared him, hoping that awareness might weaken its effect. It did not. The silence absorbed this explanation as it had absorbed everything else. The room did not defend itself. It did not need to. By the time the prisoner's voice faltered again, there was a profound stillness within him that bordered on surrender. He no longer believed he could control the outcome through speech. He no longer believed silence would save him either. The distinction between the two had eroded completely. He sat there, suspended between words and quiet, with the growing certainty that whatever judgment awaited him was already complete, assembled piece by piece from his own unguarded thoughts. And still, the investigator did not speak.